Hello and welcome to this course on process integration and process orchestration. Over the next couple of days and sessions, I will be walking you through what is process integration, what is process orchestration, what is the difference between process integration and process orchestration, and also be covering a lot of hands-on around various scenarios in process integration and process orchestration. The way this course has been structured is that we will walk you initially through a couple of slides. That would be the theory, while we have tried to curtail the theory to as minimum as possible. Unfortunately, there are a few things that need to be explained theoretically before we can go and demonstrate and do hands-on in the system. So the first hour or two or so would include theory understanding what is PI, what is process orchestration, how do the various components of PI work, how do the various components of PI interact with each other, and so on. So once we are done with walking you through what the various components of PI is, then we will look at each individual component of PI and then start using these components to work on the hands-on exercises. Okay, so with that, we'll kickstart this exercise. Where we are now going to walk through what is PI. So at a very high level, we are going to look at three important and essential components. Hey, what is process integration, right? Give you an introduction. Why is process integration needed in the context of customers? What role does PI do? We would also be looking at what are the various components of PI. This is something that by the end of this course you would remember even without having to look at theoretical slides. But for you to start off with, this is essential to understand what are the various components of PI and which component is used when. And finally, in this session, what we will do is we'll wrap up with what are the architecture options of PI. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, are wondering, hey, is this course process integration? Is this course process orchestration? What is the difference between process integration and process orchestration? Is there any difference at all, for that matter, between process integration and process orchestration? All of those questions would get answered when we look at the architecture options. What are the architectures of PI? What is a single stack PI? What is a dual stack PI? And so on. Rest assured, the idea of this is to make sure when you're done with this entire course, you not only understand the theory behind PI, but also are able to do sufficient amount of hands-on. So with that said, let's look at what is SAP PI, right? SAP process integration is a part of the SAP NetWeaver suite. So people who are new to the SAP landscape, SAP NetWeaver is the overall underlying platform in which most of the SAP components run. So SAP NetWeaver has multiple products in it. One of the products is SAP PI or SAP Process Integration. SAP PI is fundamentally an enterprise application integration platform. And what I mean by an EAI platform is PI is used for integrating applications. It could be a SAP application, it could be a non-SAP application. So SAP PI uh, is an EAI, Enterprise Application Integration Platform. It is also called an Enterprise Service Bus, an ESB. SAP PI enables you to integrate SAP and non-SAP applications. Now, what do I mean by integrating SAP and non-SAP applications, right? So if you look at this image on this right, we have SAP PI in the middle, in the center, and then you have multiple peripheral applications. It could be an SAP ECC 6.0 application, it could be a third-party payroll application, it could be your mainframe applications, you could have multiple other integration solutions involved. Now, all of these applications can technically talk to each other directly, but the role of PI is to provide a much more governed and sophisticated means of integrating applications. So you might be wondering, hey, yes, I understand PI is an integration platform, but then what value addition does PI do? Why, what is the role of an EAI landscape, EAI tool in a landscape? So let me explain that with an example. So let's take a case of, let's say, an SAP ECC environment, an SAP environment. I'm not going to write SAP out here. Let's take that this box as SAP. Now there's a requirement where every day this SAP system needs to send the employee data to a third party payroll system. So this is one of the integration requirements that exist in a customer landscape, and the requirement is, ECC needs to create a file, and that file will be then picked up by this particular third party system through a batch program. So if you're an ABAP programmer, if you're a Java programmer, you would say, hey, that's going to be very simple. I would write a program in SAP ECC that's now going to do whatever extraction of the data it needs from whatever SAP tables, and then I can create the file. So basically, what I can do is, why do I need PI? My ECC environment can directly integrate with this third-party system by just writing an ABAP program or a Java program or whatever programming that is required. So let's say, yes, that's absolutely possible. PI is not going to add any value here. So similarly, any customer landscape is not just going to be one application. Any customer landscape will be multiples of hundreds of such applications, and each application typically needs to talk to each other. So today, the example that we saw where ECC is going to send a file to a payroll system, tomorrow there could be a requirement that there's another requirement where some data needs to go from this system to this system, from ECC to this system, from this system to this system, and so on. And it need not be just one interface, right? There could be multiple interfaces, multiple programs required. So what's going to happen is, as the customer's landscape becomes complicated, as things begin evolving, you would end up with what is called as a spaghetti model. Like if you look at it, I've kept it very simple, but if you look at it, if there are hundreds of such interfaces, imagine a customer landscape where there are hundreds to thousands of such interfaces. What's going to end up is you would end up with what is called as a spaghetti model. And if you see this is now beginning to resemble a spaghetti where data is flowing all over and all across. Now, can you imagine if this is how your customer's landscape is, if this is how data is moving? What if one program needs to change? What if this application is getting upgraded? You would not know what are all the programs in your landscape that is sending data here. It is eventually going to become a landscape that becomes much more complicated, much difficult to upgrade, much difficult to maintain, because what you have is point-to-point connections that end up becoming what we call as a spaghetti, or multiple connections and with no structure associated to it. What does PI do in this case, right? How does PI help? So let me show that. Now let's assume that PI is sitting in the middle here, and you have all these applications that we were talking about, right? Just before, all of these applications that we were talking about, all of these applications are going to be here. And now instead of all these applications talking directly to each other, these applications are going to talk to PI, and PI is going to then forward the message or translate the message, connect to this system, and so on. So that way what you would end up with is not a spaghetti model, but much more, as you can see on this picture, a much more beautiful picture. Even if there are hundreds of lines going out here, it's going to be a much more evolved model, much more supportable model, where even if this application is upgrading, you would be able to say, hey, there are 10 interfaces that are running in PI connecting to this applications, and do an impact analysis of that. So the underlying idea of an enterprise application integration or enterprise service bus is that it enables you to integrate all your applications in much more governed manner, in much more streamlined manner, rather than just build point-to-point connections. Okay, so let's go back to our slides. As I was telling, PI is used to integrate SAP and non-SAP applications, and as you can see here, you can have hundreds of applications that are connected to PI. Your application developers on the SAP side need not worry about connectivity and stuff like that. All they have to do is they write their programs that connect to PI, and PI takes care of connecting to all the third party applications. You have a much more sophisticated, and you have a much more cleaner architecture that way. PI is used for both A to A and B to B integration. What do I mean by A to A integration? Oops, sorry. I'll go back. What do I mean by A to A integration, right? A to A integration is nothing but application to application integration. Just look at this box. Assume that these are all the applications within one particular customer's landscape, right? In that case, all of these applications within the customer's landscape talking to each other is called application to application integration. What you see here, this is a firewall. Basically, if data has to flow over the internet, what if you have another customer uh, uh, having a similar set of landscape, similar set of applications, and so on. So if two different corporate entities have to talk to each other, let's take the case of a conglomerate, a big conglomerate like Unilever, right? And let's take another conglomerate like Walmart. Uh, when Walmart needs to place a purchase order, Walmart is not going to be picking up the phone and talking to Unilever directly. Walmart is going to trigger the purchase order electronically, and Walmart is going to do that through their middleware. And obviously now the data has to go over the internet electronically to Unilever. So this example where data is flowing across corporate entities over the internet, that kind of integration is what is called B2B integration, or business to business integration. When the integration happens between multiple businesses, that kind of integration is called B2B integrations. A to A integrations, just to summarize, are integrations that happens within a corporate landscape. Uh, what else about SAP PI, right? SAP PI runs on SAP Web Application Server. So if you understand the architecture of SAP NetWeaver, all components on SAP NetWeaver uses SAP Web Application Server, and similarly PI also uses a SAP Web Application Server. This is a slide where I would be spending a lot of time on, at least in the initial stages. It might be a little overwhelming for people, but rest assured, as you start doing the hands-on, you would start using all of these, and over probably the second or the third hands-on that you do, you would have used all these components, and you would start becoming extremely comfortable with these components. But then it is important for you to understand how PI's architecture, how PI's components, what are the various components of PI, which is why this slide is gonna be of is gonna be of importance. Okay, so just give me a second. I'm gonna do this. Okay, so go back. Yeah. So we'll start from the bottom left and then keep moving rightwards, okay? The first component of PI that I would like to talk about is what we call as the SLD, or the System Landscape Directory. So if you're from a basis background, or if you're from a solution manager background, you would already be aware of what is System Landscape Directory, or SLD. But for those who have no background to it, do not worry. And SLD is nothing but remember the underlying idea of PI, that it is a central application that is going to integrate with multiple applications in the landscape. So for PI, it is essential to understand what all systems are in the landscape, because eventually PI is connecting to multiple different systems, right? So the SLD, or System Landscape Directory, is a component of PI that tells PI what are all the systems that are there in the landscape, in the customer's landscape. When we talk about systems, it could be your ECC system, it could be a third-party system, it could be your a SAP portal system, it could be a cloud system like Success Factors. At the end of the day, the System Landscape Directory, or the SLD, provides information of what a customer's landscape is. And as the name implies, it is directory. When we talk about directory, it is like your yellow pages, or where you have the listing of all the systems in the landscape. So the idea behind SLD is all systems in your landscape register themselves to the PI SLD. So PI understands what all systems are there in a particular customer's landscape, and is able to then connect to them, understands what are their products, what are the software components that it has, and so on. So at this point, what is essential for you to understand is SLD is nothing but like a phone book that contains all the systems that in a customer's landscape register themselves on the SLD, so that PI can use that information when PI is exchanging messages with these systems. So SLD is equal to your telephone directory is equal to all the systems in your landscape. Okay, good. So we will move on to the next component. This is what we call as the enterprise services repository. It was also called integration repository in the previous releases of PI, but we would use what is the newer term, and it is the integration repository is now called the enterprise services repository. Enterprise services repository is the design time of PI. So what I mean by design time is this is where we do all the design term work in PI. Because you're integrating applications, you need, and you're exchanging data between systems, you need to tell, hey, system A is going to be send me data in a particular format, and system B expects the data in a particular format. So all that kind of definition that says what is the data format going to be, what is the mapping going to be. PI is not just integrating applications by connecting to each other, but it also can translate data from one format to another. So an SAP system can send an IDOC to PI, and PI can then convert it into a flat file and send it to a third-party system. So all that level of information where you're doing the design time work happens in the enterprise service repository. Integration directory is the component of PI where you're doing all the configuration. What I mean by configuration is whatever work you've done in the enterprise service repository, those are all individual building blocks. All those individual building blocks will get connected to with each other in the integration directory. Okay. So this is what we call as the configuration time, and the enterprise service repository is what we call as a design time. So you design your development here, you design your interfaces here, you configure your interfaces here. When I say configuring, if you need to connect to an FTP server, you provide the FTP username, password out here. If you need to connect to an SAP system, you provide the SAP system's username, password out here, and so on. Okay. With that, we would move to what is the heart of PI, which is the integration server. The integration server is what we call as the runtime of PI. Okay, when we say the runtime, this is where the messages get processed. This is where whatever is being sent to PI will get processed. So the integration server is the runtime of PI, and this in turn contains three essential components: the central adapter engine, the integration engine, and the business process engine. The central adapter engine is nothing but the connectivity layer. It contains all the adapters. So basically, because PI needs to talk to multiple applications, PI needs to support different types of connectivity options. So that is done by the central adapter engine. The integration engine is where the main pipeline of PI gets executed, and the business process engine is where a specific component of PI called CCBPM will execute. Okay. So let me do one thing. All right. So let me just for the ease of use here, I'll just say okay. So we are back. As we were saying, the integration server is the component which is the heart of PI, which is the runtime of PI, and this contains three different engines. One is the central adapter engine where all the connectivity happens. This adapter engine runs on the Java stack of PI. Then you have the integration engine. This is where the pipeline of PI gets executed, and this runs on the ABAP stack. And you have a specific component called business process engine that is used for what we call as a CCBPM. At this point, this is sufficient. This information is sufficient that business process engine is used for just CCBPMs. Okay. I'm not going to go into these slides slides at this point. We will revisit them subsequently. But just to summarize, uh, before we go on to these two parts, because that's been a lot of data that's been told, your system landscape directory is equivalent to the white pages or the telephone directory, where all the systems in your landscape register on the SLD. The enterprise service repository is the design time of PI, is the component where you do your design time work. Your integration directory is where you configure the interfaces, so this is your configuration time. And the integration server is the runtime. Enterprise service repository equal to design time, integration directory equal to configuration time, and integration server is equal to the runtime of PI. And when we talk about runtime, the integration server, it has three components: the central adapter engine that does most of the connectivity, the integration engine that has the pipeline, and the business process engine where the CCBPM will execute. Each of these engine does different actions. Each of these engines are monitored differently. So, which brings us to these components: the runtime workbench and the configuration and the monitoring. These two are what is a part of the monitoring framework. So if you obviously, because PI is exchanging messages from one system to another system, it is essential to be able to monitor what happened to a message. Did an IDOC from SAP get delivered to the downstream system? Did a file from a third party system get delivered to SAP? All that amount of monitoring happens within these two components, which is the runtime workbench and the PI monitoring. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the non-central adapter engine at this point in time. We will revisit them probably closer to the end of this course when we are looking at the various architecture options of PI. And finally, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you have an SAP system, you have a service provider, you have service consumers. What are all these? These are all the various applications or the different types of applications that PI can connect to. And that connectivity happens via either the integration engine or the adapter engine. So PI can connect to an SAP system, it can connect to a third party system, it could be a web service provider, it could be a web service consumer, it could connect to a file system, a database system, a JMS, and so on. Okay, so this is what at the end of the day is the heart of PI. You will be using each of these components of PI extensively. And when I say extensively, this is where the development of PI happens. This is where you would, these are the components, three components where you will do all your development. These are the components where you will monitor your message, see, hey, is my development okay? Is it working fine? And this is where you would do the monitoring to see in the real runtime what really happens. Okay? And these are the various kinds of applications that PI can connect to. Okay. So now that you saw various components of PI, what are the various tools that you use to connect to these? What are the various tools that are used to connect to the components of PI, right? We will start from the bottom. System landscape directory. Again, I will at the risk of being repetitive, so that I'm just repeating it. So again, it registers yourself. System landscape directory is your telephone directory, is equivalent to your telephone directory. It contains all the systems in your landscape because PI is connecting to those systems. System landscape directory is accessed via a browser. So you can use an Internet Explorer, you can use your Chrome, you can use your Firefox. There are certain restrictions around which version of browser supports which version of PI, but at the end of the day, the client or the front-end tool that you use to connect to the system landscape directory is a browser. The enterprise service repository is your design time of PI, where you design your interfaces. And what are the tools that you use, right? SAP provides three different tools that you can use. You use a Java-based client called Integration Builder. It is a Java WebStart-based client. So in 90% of the hands-on, in 90% of the work that we do in this course, we would be using the Integration Builder, which is the Java web-based WebStart client. I will show you how to launch this. Do not worry. At this point, just remember that the enterprise service repository is launched using a Java WebStart-based client. As long as you have Java installed on your machines, you will be able to launch the enterprise service repository. You can also use a browser based for just browsing through the enterprise service repository, and you can also use an SAP NetWeaver Developer Studio to connect to the enterprise service repository. The NWDS is a newer feature that all the work that you can do in the Java Web Start is also supported in the NetWeaver Developer Studio. But for this course, we would predominantly be using the integration builder or the Java web-based client. The integration directory is typically accessed using the Java Web Start. Again, the Java-based client, which is nothing but Java Web Start. The runtime components of PI, be it the adapter engine, the integration engine, or the business process engine, is typically accessed using the SAP GUI. And the runtime workbench, basically your monitoring framework, is accessed using the browser. So this could, again, like I mentioned, be any of the browsers. There are certain compatibilities that you need to take care of, but in principle, most of the browsers are supported. Okay, so what else is there in the PI component overview? We'll now look at the enterprise service repository. So within the enterprise service repository, if you look at it, these are the various types of objects that you would be building within the enterprise service repository. At this point, I'm not going to go into each of these objects. I'll just at a very high briefly touch upon these objects, and then when we are building them on the system, you will be able to understand them. But to give you an overview, within the enterprise service repository, which is what is the enterprise service repository? It is the design time of PI, and it is accessed using either the Java Web Start or NetWeaver Developer Studio, or it can also be used accessed via Web UI. But typically in this course, you're going to be using the Java Web Start, and the enterprise service repository contains various different types of objects. You would create what we call as data types, what we call as message interface or service interfaces. There are different types of editors that are called scenario editors. So you would have a data type editor, you would have an XPath editor, you would have a mapping editor. All of these in the enterprise service repository, because it is the design time of PI, you would be building individual objects that are going to comprise your interface. So all of these objects is what you would be designing and building in your enterprise service repository using different types of editors. One another thing, the enterprise service repository is dependent on the system landscape directory. So what is the system landscape directory? It is the SLD, which contains all the systems that are there in your landscape. It is your telephone directory of your customer landscape. So, but from a systems perspective, so the enterprise service repository reads what we call a software component version from the system landscape directory. Again, do not worry about this. This is just a theoretical information. We will be seeing how the software components are created in the SLD and how they are used within the enterprise service repository. You can also connect to an SAP system and import structures. What we mean by structures is when you're exchanging messages between multiple systems, there would be, let's take the case of an SAP system. SAP already has RFCs, BAPIs, IDOCs, all of that, right? So that is a predefined structure that SAP provides. So you can connect to an SAP backend and import all the SAP structures into your enterprise service repository. One another important stuff about PI, or one another advantage of PI in the context of SAP customers is SAP provides content for the enterprise service repository that can be imported into the enterprise service repository. So let me take an example. What if you have an integration of an SRM system between a MM and a SUS system? So these are two separate SAP systems. So what SAP does is, because both of them are standard SAP systems, SAP and these system needs some kind of integration. SAP also provides the enterprise service repository content that you can just import into the ESR, and once you import into the ESR, all you need to do is just configure these interfaces. So no real build or development of an interface is required. Similarly, let's take the case of another SAP product. let's take the case of SAP ECC 6.0 that needs to now be integrated with, let's say, an SAP cloud-based solution like SuccessFactors. SuccessFactors, as you would all know, is SAP's leading HR solutions. So what if you need to now integrate SAP ECC 6.0 with SAP SuccessFactors? Again, both of these are SAP products. So what SAP has done is SAP provides you with enterprise service repository content that can just be imported directly into PI, so that from an interface development perspective, all you're doing is configuring those interfaces. So what these kind of content that SAP provides is called pre-delivered integration content. So the idea of pre-delivered integration content is that SAP is building the content. You do not need to build anything in PI. The only thing you would do is import that content into the enterprise service repository, and after you import it into the enterprise service repository, you would just configure the interface in the integration directory. Okay. Again, we've already touched upon it. You use a browser-based web UI. You can use a NetWeaver Developer Studio, which uses Eclipse, or you can use Java Web Start to access it. What is integration directory? Your integration directory, as we had just touched upon a couple of minutes ago, is your configuration time of PI. So when we talk about configuration time, all the objects that you build in the enterprise service repository, those objects will get used in the configuration time or in the integration directory, and you have multiple configuration editors and wizards that can be used to define how an end-to-end interface is going to execute in the runtime in PI. So I'm not going to go into each of these boxes. We would look at them individually when we are building the interface. But what you need to understand at this point in time is integration directory is your configuration time. You have multiple wizards. You have multiple editors that SAP provides. These are all off-the-shelf editors, off-the-shelf wizards that you would be using to do your configuration in PI. Okay. So what you use Java-based graphical tools that I started using Java Web Start. We will now touch upon, just one concept called managed web service and basic web service. So before we go into managed web service and basic web service, what I want to explain is what is the concept of a web service. Web service, as the name implies, is anything that is accessible over the web or over the internet or over the browser, and that, as it is a service, has a request and a response. So typically SAP provides multiple web services, and SAP ECC environment provides multiple web services. What you see here, SAP NetWeaver AS application server or ABAP application server, you can always access a SAP web service directly through a third-party web service client, right? You do not need to use PI for that, and that kind of a web service is called a basic web service. Now, typically what you would do is you would not want to expose everything in ECC directly to a third-party system. Why? Remember the spaghetti model that we had talked upon? If you start opening up point-to-point connections, your entire integration landscape is going to become a mess, and which is why the PI comes into picture, or the enterprise service runtime comes into picture. And what you do here is, you expose the web service that is there in ECC through PI, and that becomes a managed web services. So the third-party systems, instead of connecting directly to ECC, will now connect via PI. And then PI would in turn connect to ECC, or it can make a call to another third-party system or to any other SAP system, and so on. And those components are called the managed web service. One last thing that I wanted to touch upon in the PI components is the business process engine. Remember, we had touched upon business process engine. What was the business process engine? It was used as the runtime of CCBPM. Okay. So let's take this example. We have business system 1, business system 2, and business system 3. What do I mean by business system? Business system is nothing but an end system, right? You have one end system 1, an end system 2, and an end system 3, and because any system and any IT system in a landscape does some business functionality. They are called business systems. And what if the requirement is all these three systems will send messages to PI, and then PI needs to combine all the three messages, wait for three different messages from three different systems, collect these messages, combine them, and then send them to a third, fourth system, right? If you have to orchestrate a business process like this, the component that you use is called CCBPM. CCBPM stands for Cross Component Business Process Management. Again, do not worry about it. We will be covering this in detail in our subsequent sections. But CCBPM stands for Cross Component Business Process Management. And the idea of a CCBPM is to enable you to orchestrate a business process in PI for stateful interactions. And what do we mean by stateful interactions? Is when PI receives message 1, it knows that it has to wait for message 2 and message 3. It has to persist the message until all the three messages are received. So that kind of persistence, or that kind of an interaction or a message orchestration in PI is called a stateful interaction. Okay, so for to build such kind of business processes, to build such kind of integration patterns in PI, we use a component that is called CCBPM. That is what is called the design time component, and that CCBPM runs in the runtime on the business process engine. And the CCBPM are built using a graphical modeler. So there is an editor within the enterprise of service repository with which you design your CCBPMs. Okay. The CCBPM is based on an industry standard called BPEL. CCBPM enables you to design and model your interfaces and so on. We'll not spend more time here. Very finally, this is something that is very important. The next section of next 10 minutes is probably very, very important, because this is going to now touch upon a question that I asked at the beginning of this session, saying, hey, is this course a process integration course, or is this course a process orchestration course? What is the difference between process integration and process orchestration? Those questions are now going to be answered in this session. Before that, let's just talk about a little bit of the history of PI. I'm not going all the way back to 2005, 2004 when PI was launched, but just when were the latest releases of PI launched. PI 7.31 was launched in November 2011. PI 7.4 was launched in April 2013, and the latest version of PI is PI 7.5, which was released as late as November 2015, right? With PI, till PI 7.11, a lot of features were restricted. There were a lot of restrictions on the product suite, but with PI 7.31 and PI 7.4, what we brought about is a single stack execution of PI. So what I mean by a single stack execution of PI is that previously PI's components needed mandatorily, PI installation required mandatorily an ABAP stack and a Java stack. So what do we mean by an ABAP stack and a Java stack? A PI installation would have an ABAP component and a PI installation would have a Java component. But with PI 7.31, we brought in SAP introduced a new installation option for PI that was called a single stack or a Java only PI. What that meant is all the functionality that was being done on the ABAP stack of PI was now possible on a Java only PI, which made customers' life easy from a monitoring perspective, from a hardware perspective, and so on. So what you need to understand is from PI 7.31, you have two installation options of PI. You can have a dual stack installation. A dual stack installation is an installation where you have both ABAP and Java combined together, or you can do a single stack installation of PI, which is nothing but a Java only PI, right? And that Java only installation of PI was called an Advanced Adapter Engine, AAE. It was also called Adapter Engine Extended, AEX. So the idea being that SAP, as we all know, historically keeps changing the names of its components. So both of these components mean one and the same. Adapter Engine Extended, AEX, Advanced Adapter Engine, AAE. This is nothing but a single stack or a standalone installation of PI. A dual stack installation of PI is just ABAP and is a combination of both ABAP and Java installation of PI. Okay, so far all we've been talking about is process integration. I have not touched upon process orchestration as yet, but I want to make sure that all of us understand that process integration is nothing but your enterprise application integration platform, or EAI platform from SAP, that enables you to integrate multiple SAP and non-SAP applications. SAP PI has multiple components. We had seen all those components beginning from system landscape directory to an enterprise service repository to the integration directory to the integration server, right? We had seen all of that, and now what we are talking about is that from PI 7.31, SAP introduced two installation options for PI. One was a classical installation option that had both ABAP stack and Java stack. The other was a single stack installation of PI where it was a Java only. So only a Java stack was used, and that was called an adapter engine extended and the advanced adapter engine. And all of this just holds true for PI. So what is process orchestration, right? So process orchestration is nothing but Java only PI, or a process, sorry, I'll correct myself. So first what I would like to talk about is what is process orchestration in that case. Process orchestration is a combination of three separate SAP products that have been bundled together and licensed and now sold as a single SAP product. So process orchestration is nothing but a combination of AEX, adapter engine extended. What is adapter engine extended? It is your Java only PI, right? So process orchestration is a combination of your Java only PI, NetWeaver business process management, and NetWeaver business rules management. So these three products of SAP were combined together, licensed and frameworked as a single product called SAP PO. Okay, so a process orchestration is nothing but a combination of three SAP products. A Java only PI, which is called AEX, SAP Business Rules Management, and SAP Business Process Management. So SAP Process Orchestration is again, does SAP Process Orchestration have an ABAP stack? The answer is no. SAP Process Orchestration is a Java only product, but it combines three different products, right? A single stack Java only PI, a business process management, and a business rules management. So to summarize, what are the various architecture options of PI and PO? PI is nothing but process integration, and process integration can be installed as a dual stack installation, which is but an ABAP and a Java installation, or a Java only installation, which was called an adapter engine extended, or AEX. Another evolution of process integration was called process orchestration, where SAP combined SAP Java only PI, business rules management, and business process management into a single product. So a process integration is not process orchestration. Process integration and process orchestration are separate products from SAP, but process orchestration has all the features of process integration plus some additional features. So you need to be aware that from a licensing perspective, process orchestration has separate licensing, process integration has separate licensing, but from a features perspective, process orchestration includes all the features of a Java only PI and additional features of NetWeaver business rules management and business process management. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of the first set of theory that we wanted. Now from this point on, we will start doing much more hands-on, where in the subsequent discussions, what we would be doing is we would be looking at the system landscape directory, or the SLD. We would be building some stuff on the SLD, and then we would be moving on to the enterprise service repository and the integration directory. To summarize what we've looked at in the past 50 odd minutes, we've looked at a very high level what is process, and for that I'll move on to the agenda slide so we can summarize it from there. We had introduced you to PI. PI is an enterprise application integration platform We had talked about why PI is important. Remember the spaghetti model that we spoke about, where you have multiple systems talking to each other in a point-to-point connection will cause chaos, and that's why PI is introduced as your enterprise application integration product. Then we looked at the various components of PI. To summarize the various components, the most critical ones: system landscape directory. It is your telephone directory. All the systems in your landscape register themselves on the system landscape directory. Enterprise service repository, it is your design time of PI. Enterprise service repository is the design time of PI, where you design your interfaces. It runs on the Java stack. It uses the Java Web Start. You can use the NetWeaver Developer Studio, but for this particular 90% of this course, we will use the Java Web Start. Integration directory is the configuration time of your PI server. Is that correct? Yes, integration directory is the configuration time of your PI server, where all the individual components that you build in the enterprise service repository are combined together to form an end-to-end interface. Then you had the runtime of PI. The runtime of PI is called the integration server, which contains three components or three engines: the adapter engine, the integration engine, and the business process engine. Okay, and then we touched upon at a very high level each of these components, what all do they contain. We touched upon that, and then we looked upon the architecture options of PI. What is a single stack PI, what is a dual stack PI, and what is the difference between process integration and process orchestration. Okay, with this we come to the end of our first session. We will now move on to the next session in the next slides, where we would walk through the SLD, and then we will start building our first interface together. Okay, awesome. So I will see you in the next session soon.